Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today for the 5th Annual Solar in the Southeast Report webinar. My name is Kate Tracy, and I'm a Communications Manager at the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. And today we'll hear presentations from Brian Jacob, who is the report author for Solar in the Southeast. And we'll also hear from SACE's Research Director, Maggie Schober. And doing an intro, we'll hear from Steve Smith, our Executive Director. But just wanted to start off with some housekeeping items. We will be presenting for the majority of the hour, and following the presentation, we will have a Q&A. If you have a question during the webinar, feel free to submit it using the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. We will not be monitoring the chat for questions during the presentation. We will just be following it through the Q&A box, but if you have something to say in chat, feel free to. If we do not get to your question, we will be monitoring all questions and we'll try to follow up with you following the webinar, or you can reach out to Brian following the webinar. We'll have his contact information listed on the screen. We will send a recording of this webinar to all registered participants, and we will post it on our website. So if you are not able to stay the entire time but would like to check back in on the presentation, you will be able to do that since you registered. All right, so let's go ahead and start us off. Steve, if you can take it away.
Great, can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Great, thanks everybody for joining. My name is Stephen Smith and I'm the Executive Director of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. And it's with great excitement that we're going to share with you the 5th annual Solar in the Southeast report. This has been a really challenging time for the solar industry. There's been a number of things with the supply chain, international tariffs, lots of things that have put some pressure on the development of solar in our region. But our region continues to see significant growth. We believe and have believed for a long time that solar is going to be a dominant workhorse technology for solving the climate crisis and for the future of the utility industry in our region. And we can continue to see that. One thing in particular that I want to just call attention to that developed since we had gotten very far along in the report and will begin to manifest in future reports. But I did want to particularly call out NextEra and Florida Power and Light's a very bold proposal that they put on the table called Real Zero. This is a very significant commitment by a major utility in the Southeast to move towards zero carbon, not net zero carbon, but they're kind of trolling the other utilities that have sort of set this net zero goal, but with Real Zero. But what is most significant about it in relationship to this report is there is a dramatic commitment to solar power that Florida Power and Light has made for the state of Florida. They're committing to over 90,000 megawatts of solar being built out by 2045. 90,000 megawatts, 90 gigawatts. This is a very dramatic and very, very significant proposal. And it is a kind of a game changer in the region because it shows a major utility making a very significant commitment to make solar power a dominant part of their portfolio. And we have for a long time felt that that is what is necessary. And so we welcome NextEra and Florida Power Light's proposal. Now, obviously, there's a lot of questions we have. This has just come out in the last few weeks. We have a standing request with FP&L to sit down and talk more with them about this proposal, because part of the commitment of that volume of solar production is also to develop hydrogen through hydrolysis. And this is this green hydrogen technology using solar and water is a new technological development that we have some questions about, but it's a very bold and strong commitment. So in the context of this report, we wanted to make mention of this, and we'll continue to keep people posted as we get more information from FP&L and NextEra on their development plans for the region. But with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Brian Jacobs, the lead author in the report, and thanks everybody for joining. Brian?
Thanks, Steve. So let me start with kind of introducing. Well, actually, let me go back and say thank you, just like Steve did as well, to all of you that are here, and reiterate how excited I am for this particular launch, since it's the 5th. It's hard to believe that we've been doing this now for 5 years, but that gives us an opportunity toward the end where I can do a little bit of comparison with what we said 5 years ago, because since we do a 4-year rolling forecast. So I'm looking forward to going back and touch on that. I know some of you have likely been with us that entire journey. So I'd be really keen to know how many of these solar reports and solar webinars y'all have participated in. So I think we have a poll, there we go, that's going to show up, and you can let us know that. Because I'm just curious to know if anybody's been here for the whole ride. And then I'll pick up with introducing SACE. Just some of you might not be completely familiar with who we are, but we're a nonprofit clean energy advocacy organization that promotes responsible and equitable energy choices throughout the Southeast. How do I get rid of the poll on my screen so that I can move ahead?
Brian, I think you can just hit the red X box at the top left corner.
Yeah, all right. Funny enough, it is hidden behind, oh, there, I can move it out of the way. Okay, perfect. Now I think I can move us ahead. I want to spend some time on terminology. I did this at the beginning of the last webinar, and I think it helped to avoid some confusion later on, but I've got a few prelude comments I wanted to offer even in advance of that. One of those is that the biggest news, obviously, since our last report has been the supply chain disruption. Steve kind of touched on it a little bit, and we did incorporate that into this year's forecast, so I'll be able to talk about that a little bit. The second is that some of you may have already downloaded the Appendix B, where we list all of the individual utilities, and you might have noticed that it has less utilities in it than it did last year. So I wanted to kind of explain that up front. The smallest utilities in the country don't have to do the full EIA 861 form every year. They're allowed to do a short form version, 861S, and it doesn't give us everything that we need to report comprehensively on those utilities. Now, they're still required to do the full 861 form every few years. It used to be every 5 years, now it's every 8, and coincidentally, there's a comment period due at the end of this week, in fact, July 22nd, about that reporting process and what the right level of reporting is for the smaller utilities. Anyhow, that's why Appendix B had 485 utilities listed last year and only has 334 utilities this year, in case anyone was curious. And then the third prelude comment is that we've added a new appendix this year. You might have noticed Appendix C in there, which offers a glimpse into the progress that some of the utilities are making with storage here in the Southeast. Some combined with solar, others a standalone storage, which still has a benefit for solar. And when we get to that, Maggie Schoper is going to chime in and provide some insight on it. All right, so now onto this terminology slide, and it'll be a refresher from last year for those of you that were with us. We talk about both capacity and energy, and the capacity units are either megawatts or gigawatts. And there's just a factor of 1,000 difference between those. A gigawatt is 1,000 megawatts, but that's a unit of the instantaneous capacity that a solar farm can put out. When we talk about megawatt hours or gigawatt hours, those are measures of the energy or generation that's produced by those resources. And we use both of those terms in the report, but there's far more discussion about capacity, megawatts or gigawatts. And that's because our primary metric in the report is what we call watts per customer solar ratio, where we divide the capacity of solar for a given utility or a given state by the number of retail customers that are served by that utility or that live in that state. And then the last point of clarification on this slide is that there's one page in the report, it's page 11, where we report on the solar capacity in the state where it's physically located. For all of the other pages of the report where we talk about capacity, we reapportion it to where it is serving load. In many cases, it doesn't matter. So like the utilities in Florida, it's all apportioned to them within the state. But if you take utilities like Duke Energy Progress or Duke Energy Carolinas that both serve in North Carolina and South Carolina, that's where we do this reapportioning. Similarly for the utilities that are served by TVA, since it's a 7-state region of its own. But when we get to that, I'll illustrate how this year, mathematically, 14% of the solar capacity that's installed in the state of North Carolina actually serves load across the border in South Carolina. And with that, I'll move on into the kind of real content of the report. This slide is from page 5 in the report. I didn't take the slides for this webinar in sequence out of the report, so I'll be bouncing around a little bit. I'll try to correlate where we are. But page 5 of the report has this graph, and on a full year operational equivalent basis, the 7-state region of the Southeast had a little over 15 gigawatts in 2021, 15,131 megawatts to be precise with it. And with around 31 million retail customers, that gives the full region a ratio of 484 watts per customer for calendar year 2021. We always look backwards to last year as our base and forward 4 years for our time horizon. I also pointed out, both on this slide and in the report itself, how significant the impact has been of this present supply chain disruption that we're experiencing. Essentially, for this year and next year, 2022 and 2023, we're now forecasting about 2 gigawatts lower than we included in the report forecast from last year. Georgia Power is an example of that. They alone, so one utility in one state of the Southeast, has delayed almost a gigawatt, 970 megawatts of projects that would have come online next year. They're going to be delayed by a full year into 2024. And then one kind of later breaking piece of news that we did incorporate into the report ever so briefly. You may know that President Biden announced a series of steps last month that would help to address this situation. And that includes a 24-month moratorium on import duties from 4 key countries: Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, and Cambodia, the ones that are subject to the Auxin petition. And so in this report, we are now anticipating that after that delay in 22 and 23, where we've scaled back our forecast, when we get to 2024, we are anticipating that those forecasts kind of reunite. The current forecast reunites with what we were saying last year. So 2024 is going to be about 27 gigawatts. And then now that we've extended to 2025 for this forecast, we're projecting 30 gigawatts, which is double where we were last year, 2021. All right, so the slide that I'm showing now is from page 11 of the report. This is the one that I mentioned where we allocate the solar to the state where it's physically located. And in last year's report, you may recall that Florida had just overtaken North Carolina as the leader in the Southeast. And they have never looked back. Florida is now, well, we're reporting 5.6 gigawatts for 2021 in Florida, almost 5.7 gigawatts. And North Carolina gets 4.3 And as I mentioned, 14% of that is actually serving load in South Carolina instead. The other thing that we flagged in last year's report was that Georgia would also, like Florida, surpass North Carolina by 2024. With the supply chain disruption and our reforecasting now, it's slowed down the growth in Georgia a little bit. And so we're not projecting that transition for Georgia to surpass North Carolina until 2025 instead of 2024. So 1 year later than we were saying last year, at least for installed capacity is what we're looking at now. Georgia will still surpass North Carolina on that watts per customer ratio by 2024, just not the total solar capacity. And then the last thing I'd say on this slide, I probably don't even need to point this out, but you can look at the slide and see that Alabama, Tennessee, and Mississippi are trailing significantly. This is from page 10 of the report, and it shows the state breakdown as a pie chart, or I should probably say a donut chart. And the main thing I wanted to do with including this one was to reiterate how I said on the last slide, 4.3 gigawatts of solar for North Carolina. That was where it's physically installed. But when we reapportion it to where it's serving load, that's why it reallocates about 600 megawatts. So we're giving North Carolina credit here on what we call our load state evaluation of 3.675 gigawatts. And South Carolina is the reciprocal of that. They have less installed, about 600 megawatts less than what is shown here, but they're getting credit for some of what's installed in North Carolina, but serving load in their state. This is from page 12. Both the graph and the table come off of page 12 of the report. We always include this page to talk about the policies behind the performance. And a year ago, we were super bullish on Congress passing a federal clean electricity standard, perhaps in a form of incentives, so-called carrots and sticks, was being contemplated in what was at the time called the Clean Electricity Performance Program. Well, that ship has sailed. And even though those aspects didn't make it into the Build Back Better Act that passed in the House, until just last week, we were still anticipating that a package of tax credits that had passed in the House could also be adopted in the Senate. Those would have been tremendous. They would have returned the federal investment tax credit back to its original 30% level. We're at 26% now, and we'll ratchet down to 22% next year. If that package passed, and I'm not totally giving up hope yet, it would return that to the full 30% and extend it for up to 10 years. It would have included an investment tax credit for standalone storage, because right now to qualify for the ITC, storage has to be coupled with solar. Standalone storage would have had its own ITC. And the package would have made those tax credits what are called direct pay, which meant they could be refundable to nonprofit entities or to other taxpayers who just didn't have enough tax liability to fully utilize the credits. They'd be able to get a refund on them. So all of that stuff is now in limbo, because you probably saw that we had some disappointing announcements last week from Senator Manchin that he's no longer willing to entertain that package of clean energy items. At SACE, we've had an action item or an action alert related to this for quite some time, encouraging members to contact your elected officials to express support for this package. And I think we can probably post that into the chat for anybody that would like to take advantage of it, because I think it's still advantageous for our clean energy voters that are out there to make sure that the elected officials know there's interest for this, and we've got their backs if they vote favorably. On the brighter side, let's talk about some state activities. Particularly with regard to net metering, there was a fair bit of activity over the last year. Just about this time last year, South Carolina Public Service Commission approved the next evolution of net metering for that state that SACE and others helped to negotiate with Duke Energy. So that got approved in South Carolina. A similar version of that proposal is currently pending at the North Carolina Utilities Commission as well. And then if we shift to Florida, after a very bad bill that was backed by Florida Power and Light, that would have decimated the rooftop solar market in Florida, passed both the House and the Senate there, Governor DeSantis stepped in and vetoed it. So for our forecast currently, the distributed solar forecast, that segment in Florida remains strong, but we're well aware that a similar bill could resurface in a subsequent legislative session. So we do have to remain vigilant there as well. All right, this is from page 8 of the report, and it's, I say it's always a fan favorite. This is where we disclose the annual Sunriser list. And those are the 7 utilities that exhibit the highest ambition over the next 4-year time horizon. And I'd start at the top and just say that, after making it onto the list for the first time last year, they were number 2. Knoxville Utilities Board has now edged out Walton EMC for the very top slot this year. And that was despite them having a reduced 2025 forecast because of the supply chain disruption. In fact, both Knoxville and Walton both are lower now than we were projecting last year. But still within that, Knoxville Utilities Board just barely beat out Walton to get that top slot. Then I want to mention 2 at the bottom of the list there. Lakeland Electric made the Sunriser list for the first time, and Florida Power and Light returned to the Sunriser list for the first time in 3 years. So it's good to have those on there. The others are all familiar names. They were all on last year, but there is a familiar name that is missing this year. And I want to be careful how I reveal this. It's in the report as well, because I don't want to disparage them in any way. Quite the opposite. It is to their credit how much they've accomplished. And what we say in the report is Tampa Electric had been a perpetual Sunriser, and until this year was the only utility to appear on all 4 of our prior lists. Their falling off the Sunriser list had more to do with how much they've already done. And actually, if I go to the next slide, it'll help to emphasize that. So this slide is from page 6 of the report, and it's the current and future leaderboards of the largest utility systems in the Southeast. These 13 utilities collectively serve more than 3/4 of the Southeast population. And so you can see Tampa Electric is number 3 on the list. On the left-hand side is 2021, the right-hand side is the forecast to 2025. But Tampa Electric already has a rather high base. And since the Sunriser list is based on the increase over the next 4 years, it has become very challenging for a utility like Tampa Electric to remain on the Sunriser list, but they still remain near the top of this overall utilities list. In fact, the top 4 in the 2021 rankings are the exact same and in the same order as they were a year ago. I would emphasize Florida Power and Light, though, coming in at number 5 here. They've been steadily increasing on this leaderboard year after year, and they've cracked the top 5 now. And then if you shift your gaze over to the right-hand side of the screen, the top 5 from 2021 map through to the same top 5 in our forecast for 2025. We've already talked about Sunrisers, but before I leave this slide, I also owe a duty to talk about the SunBlockers at the opposite end of the spectrum as well. Those are the ones who mathematically project to a watts per customer ratio in 2025 that is still below the average of the region from last year. So if you look at the left-hand side of the screen, Southeast average was 484. Any of the big utilities that are on the right-hand side less than 484 get that dishonorable mention, as we call it, of the SunBlocker designation. And last year, the North Carolina Electric Cooperatives and Alabama Power were both on that naughty list. TVA and Seminole were not last year. They had managed to get out of that doghouse, but they've wound up in there again this year. Now, this is a slide, and if you weren't paying attention when I switched the slides, you might not even notice that it changed because it looks very similar to the last one, but this is not in the report. This is one that I've added because we're in our 5th year. And so now we can look back at what we said was the forecast for 2021 back in our very first report 5 years ago. And it's a bit of a mixed bag. What I would say is that some utilities over-delivered and others under-delivered. So Tampa Electric and Florida Power and Light exceeded expectations, as did Oglethorpe. Because in that very first year, we didn't anticipate how much solar Facebook was going to be commissioning through Walton EMC, which gets aggregated into the Oglethorpe power line here. So those were 3 examples of where they significantly over-delivered based on what we had projected. The Duke utilities, on the other hand, all 3 of them had really high forecasts early on, and they've been consistently dialing them back, at least in the short term. So that's why their numbers actually reflect that we had been having a higher expectation for them than they actually fulfilled. Now that we get to 2021 and have real numbers. We even had a much higher forecast for Alabama Power 5 years ago. They had been approved for 500 megawatts of solar back in 2015. So we had expected that would all be done by now. But unfortunately, they've only fulfilled about 1/5 of that, about 100 megawatts or so. So that's why you see them, considerably below what we had forecast for them 5 years ago. All right, we got 2 slides left, and this is the new appendix that I mentioned. So I'm going to let Maggie walk you through this.
Great. Thank you, Brian. This has been very informative so far. I'm going to switch gears just a little bit to talk about storage. So first, to kind of set that up of, why are we talking about storage? This is the solar report after all. I'm going to talk a little bit about how storage complements solar. So as we know, solar is a resource that obviously peaks during the day. It has a daily production that tracks with the sun, quite obviously. And as we've all heard that from utilities many times, is that we use electricity even when the sun is not shining. And so storage is a way for us to extend our use of solar. Storage is particularly useful in utility systems where there is already a lot of solar on the system. Really in higher levels of solar than we're even seeing in the Southeast yet at this point. But we can see places where there are utilities that have high levels of solar, and or utilities where or systems that are not very interconnected, such as Hawaii, which has islands and a fair amount of solar as well. So for instance, they can use storage quite a bit already. But here in the Southeast, there are a number of utilities that are exploring storage and getting some experience with it. They do see what we see, which is that this is a resource that will be needed as more and more renewables go on the grid. It is an extremely useful resource on the grid for more than just help with solar. It provides a lot of balancing capabilities. It can provide what are called ancillary services that help with the stability of the grid, and it can be more reliable than a number of thermal generation resources like your coal and gas and nuclear which struggle during certain temperature extremes, especially heat waves, like many of us are experiencing right now. So all of that as sort of a technical background on storage. You can see here there are a few projects. These are 3 of our larger utilities in the region that we've highlighted. This is by no means all of the utility battery projects that are going online or already online in the region. These are just some notable ones we wanted to present. I'll also note that there's a couple of different ways that utilities can or developers of projects can structure these projects. So they can be what's called standalone storage, which, as it sounds, is just the battery and is connected to the grid. So it can draw power from the grid and then release that power directly back to the grid. And it's charging up the battery then from whatever sources are generating electricity at the point that it's charging. The other setup that's common is solar plus storage, and those can be basically they're combined solar farms with the storage, and the storage can be behind the solar or in front of it. There's a couple of different configurations, but for those, depending on how they're configured, the battery can either charge only from the solar, or it can charge from the solar or the grid, and operate as similar to a standalone battery that way. So these projects represent a combination of both standalone storage and solar plus storage projects. The megawatts listed here, capacity is just the storage component if it is a solar plus storage. And these are typically 4-hour batteries. Now that means there is some flexibility in how they operate, but if we're measuring it by the capacity seen here as a 4-hour battery, that means that those are the megawatts that they can provide if they're discharging from full capacity down to empty over the course of 4 hours. They could discharge at a slower rate and last for 8 hours. They could do different, there's different ways that they can be operated, and there's different configurations depending on who owns the project and how the utility can call it. So the last piece I'll say here is that these are named projects. You can see the online dates range from 2019 to 2023. So they're all either online or under construction or going to be online, fairly soon. This does not include announcements that different utilities have made about sort of plans for additional storage. For instance, the NextEra Real Zero goal that was mentioned earlier, while it does include that 90 gigawatts of solar, it also includes 50 gigawatts of storage, which is quite significant compared to that's 50,000 megawatts. And you can see on here we're seeing most of these projects are in the low tens of megawatts. The exception there, of course, is Florida Power and Light's Manatee project there, which is 409 megawatts. That is combined with solar at the Manatee site there in Florida. And of course, that NextEra goal for the 50,000 megawatts is for, that's the amount that is planned for Florida Power and Light, the utility itself. So they are certainly have the largest project, solar storage project in the Southeast at this point. And with that, I think I will turn it back over to Brian to finish us up.
Thanks, Maggie. All right, so this last slide is not in the report itself either, but we do like to signal kind of what we see as the big topics moving forward. And in this case, there are some rather significant resource planning decisions on the horizon. And we also see huge opportunities and critical needs on transmission planning. So for resource planning, we are just 2 days away from a decision in Georgia Power's triennial integrated resource plan, IRP. The Georgia Public Service Commission will vote on that on Thursday morning this week. And incidentally, it includes a 265 megawatt battery storage project. So if that gets approved, then it can be added to the appendix that Maggie was just talking about. Florida Power and Light just recently withdrew what I would say is a controversial alternative planning process that they put forward. It would have been based on a winter storm event, despite the fact that Florida Power and Light is the most strongly summer peaking utility in the whole Southeast. We did a report on that a few years ago. SACE did. Maggie was one of the co-authors of that, called Seasonal Electricity Demand in the Southeast. Anyhow, Florida Power and Light was basing their plan on this kind of worst case winter event, and a number of different parties raised concerns about that, including the Office of Public Counsel in Florida. And so FPL withdrew that. So it remains to be seen next year when they file their 10-year site plan, how they approach it. And we'll also be eager to see how they incorporate this real zero goal that we've talked about into their 10-year site plan next year. The North Carolina Utilities Commission is legally required to develop a carbon plan by the end of this year. They've already looked at plans that Duke has proposed, several different scenarios, and they're just starting to look at alternative plans filed by interveners. So that's also on the horizon, and will have a significant influence on the solar forecast that we put together next year for the two Duke utilities in North Carolina. And then TVA as well has an upcoming IRP. They'll start it either late this year or early next year. And to kind of correspond to that, they have just recently issued an RFP, a request for proposal, for up to 5 gigawatts of carbon-free energy. So it's not exclusively solar, but solar plus storage will be eligible to bid into that. And I mean, we're pretty hopeful that the bids from that RFP should factor into the modeling for their IRP. And in my opinion, it's likely to reveal how irresponsible it will be to replace coal units at Kingston and Cumberland with natural gas as they propose, when there are less expensive and much cleaner options available. But we'll see how that plays out with the bids from the RFP and then the IRP modeling that they release as they start that. On the right-hand side, talking about transmission planning, that's the other key consideration. The bipartisan infrastructure package, the IIJA, Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, has made a boatload of money available for transmission. That's a technical term, boatload of money. And we definitely need it. Utilities in the Southeast have not been investing enough in transmission to support the transition to clean energy. And now what's happening is clean energy projects are being held hostage because of that insufficient transmission capacity. Example right here where I am in Georgia, in the Georgia Power IRP, the utility used a lack of south to north transmission to argue against additional solar deployment in the south of the state, which is where it can be done most cost effectively. And this is something they should have known about, because vulnerabilities like this had been surfaced in what's called SRTEP, the Southeast Regional Transmission Planning process, more than 5 years ago. And they were largely ignored because that process isn't really sufficient for stakeholder engagement. We and others have made some recommendations in the Georgia Power IRP, the one that I mentioned will be decided this coming Thursday, on how to improve this transmission planning process. So hopefully we'll get some favorable decisions later this week. All right, let's see. There's one other thing that I actually didn't mention, and that is that this is a really dynamic space. It's hard to keep up. So even since I finalized the report, there's been movement. There's a statement on the Mississippi State profile, which is page 17, that reads, dockets for a community solar program and for improvements to the net metering policy are both currently pending with the Mississippi Public Service Commission. Well, the commission has taken action. Last week, they approved the net metering program for the state of Mississippi. So that statement in the report is already out of date. And apologies for that, but like I said, it's a dynamic space and it's hard to keep up. There's a lot more in the report that I didn't highlight today. These were just the things that I really wanted to call to your attention. But let me stop and open the floor to questions, and we'll see what you'd like to talk about next.
Thanks, Brian and Maggie and Steve, for an informative, enlightening, and dare I say, entertaining presentation. Just to go over some results from the poll that we did. We had 66 people respond. Thank you for responding. And out of the majority of those, most of them are here for the first time. So thank you for joining us and learning about solar in the Southeast. But we do want to give a shout out to the 7 folks who have been here for all 5 reports. So that's pretty cool to hear that so many people have read all of the reports, and hopefully it's informing their work. So
and I'm really glad, since so many people were first timers, that I did take the time to go through that prelude stuff at the beginning and the terminology. I was kind of concerned that if people had been here all 5 years, that'd be old hat to them. I'm glad I spent the time on it.
Yeah. All right. And just a reminder for the Q&A portion, if you have any questions, submit it through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And we have had a boatload, again, technical term, of questions come in. So if we don't get to your question, we will follow up with you after the presentation, or Brian's contact info is located on the screen. And then again, a reminder, we'll be sending out a recording of this presentation as well as the actual report following the presentation. So if you need to hop off, you can do that. All right, so let's go ahead and start off. Just wanted to lay some groundwork. Brian and maybe Maggie can also answer this. Could you remind us where the data is coming from for the forecast? Is this focused on solar installations by public utilities, public sector, or both public and private sector? How do you track the data?
Okay, yeah, that's pretty simple. And there is a page in the report that talks about our methods and assumptions that goes into more detail. But effectively, we use various data sources as input. The historic and some of the future information comes primarily from the Energy Information Administration. And I had mentioned today that some of the smaller utilities don't have to report as frequently on the full forms, but there's the EIA 860 and 861, and there's also the 923 forms. Those go into our data set, and they include both currently operational units as well as those that are proposed. And they have their kind of target month and years when they would bring those online. And there's a good bit of maneuverability in those that we've encountered over the years. But then the other thing is, particularly for the regulated utilities, we rely a lot on their resource planning processes, whether it's the 10-year site plans that are filed by the Florida utilities every year, or the integrated resources plans, like I mentioned, we're right in the midst of coming to the tail end of for Georgia Power. Those provide us really good insights, particularly on the short-term forecast. They vary in kind of time horizon. Like Georgia Power's is a 20-year time horizon, but they do it every 3 years. So the more reliable stuff is the near term, and the other, we're going to have multiple IRP cycles before we would get to, the 2040 timeframe. So we put it into our data set, but it's we rely much more heavily on the short term. And our forecast that we use in this report is only out for 4 years anyway. And I guess I'll mention one thing that's, well, we also, when there are announcements, we do factor those in of discrete projects or as we've mentioned, some of these longer term goals that are announced, the Real Zero program from FPL hasn't impacted our forecast yet, because it's the 10-year site plan that's really driving the short term, and we'll wait to see what, how the Real Zero goal impacts their 10-year site plan next year. But one thing that we don't rely much on anymore is the interconnection queues. Those have become so bloated that they're really no longer a good indicator of what will be built. They're a good indicator of what could be built, but there's a lot of redundancy in there and people kind of speculatively securing spots for projects that, if the conditions are right, they will end up building. But I don't think we can rely on that as a predictor of what's really in the pipeline.
Thanks, Brian. I'll just add to that we do cover all of the utilities in the region we're covering in the Southeast, which is up from your largest IOUs down to the smallest co-ops and municipal utilities and all of that. With the caveat that Brian mentioned in the beginning about a few utilities not being in the appendix itself. And that's different from, some reports that are done by national level organizations that tend to focus on, the large investor owned or private utilities. Whereas because we are a regional organization, we're able to really get down into the littler and medium sized utilities across the Southeast.
Okay, thanks y'all. We had a couple of questions about, and Maggie touched on this when she was discussing storage, but we had a couple of questions about the Real Zero announcement that Steve also touched on at the introduction, and TVA's recent announcement of adding 5,000 megawatts of new clean energy resources by 2029. Can you just mention if and how those two announcements factor into the reporting in the report, and if they were mentioned at all?
Yeah, sure. I mentioned FPL just a minute ago and how it's interesting. As Steve mentioned, it's the first time any utility in the Southeast has really expressed an ambition at the level and scale that we have been encouraging them to. Something that actually responds to what the science says is necessary. But that announcement hasn't impacted this four-year forecast that we're working on in this report, and TVA is the same way. What's in their plans now and projects that they've already contracted for are in the four-year forecast, but they just went out to bid for these projects for 2029, and none of those are going to show up in the 2025 timeframe, so they're not in the report yet.
Yeah, and Kate, I would just emphasize that the TVA is different in the sense that we're sort of considering it more of a fishing expedition, given that there's no commitment whatsoever. It's just they're fishing across the board, and solar is only one of the technologies they're looking at. And so, again, TVA continues to lag significantly behind the major utilities in the Southeast in their commitment to solar resources. So that 5,000 megawatt fishing RFP is really to test the market, and it includes things like nuclear power and some other technologies. So we'll see what they do with it.
Yes, that's a good clarification. Oh, sorry, Maggie.
And if I can add one more thing, I mean, we have heard that. I'll first talk about TVA and then the next era piece. I mean, we have heard that this 5 gigawatt RFP that they put out, as Steve mentioned, it's not just solar. It does seem to have some interesting language that could be targeting storage. So I think that could be a positive thing, but it's not additional. So these are the projects that TVA, had already either planned to have available for its corporate customers to sign on to. And so it's not, it wouldn't, even if our forecast, included the main years that the RFP is looking at, which is 26 to 29, it would not change the forecast that we have here because, this is them going out for the projects that they already had in those years. On the NextEra piece, I mean, we again, the main gist of what NextEra seems to be planning to do is in the 2031 to 2045 timeframe, which is way beyond the scope of this one. And we will have to wait until next year's 10-year site plan to see if the near-term solar and storage for Florida Power and Light specifically changes. And there was one specific question about NextEra, which is noting that they build a lot of solar across the country. So I just wanted to clarify that the solar we're talking about here is just that is being installed and used on the grid of their regulated utility. You know, NextEra is the parent company, and that parent company owns Florida Power and Light. And here we are exclusively talking about the solar in Florida Power and Light, not the portfolio of solar that NextEra Energy Resources owns all across the country.
Thanks all. Those are really good clarifications. Let's switch into some more state-specific questions. This one is, how many total watts per customer does a utility need to have available, specifically in Georgia if it varies by state? What is solar pushing out as its capacity increases? Does distributed solar outpace utility scale in any state in the US?
Okay, there was a lot in there.
I can repeat some of that.
The last one, the last one is fresh though in my mind. So does distributed solar outpace utility scale in any state in the US? I focus on the Southeast, and it's definitely not here. I don't want to switch back to the slides, but we break the bars on our graph down. There's some blue bars that are the utility scale component, and the yellow caps on the top are the distributed solar component, kind of the rooftop solar. And it varies a little bit state to state here and utility to utility. But for the most part, it's about 90% utility scale and only about 10% distributed solar in the Southeast. There are some states where distributed solar has a higher percentage. So California comes to mind, and people in the Southeast like to emphasize that we're not California. And then I would say that Hawaii as well has a much higher penetration of rooftop solar than I think than any other state. But even there, I'm not sure that it is larger than the utility scale component. They may be on parity with one another in Hawaii. All right, so what was the first part of the question? How many watts per customer does a utility need to have? Was that the question?
Yeah, does a utility need to have available specifically in Georgia if it varies by state?
Okay, so there's no target. And in fact, the only state in the Southeast that has a renewable portfolio standard is North Carolina, and that one it has been met effectively, and things changed with the various pieces of legislation that have passed since then. So we don't have mandates for an amount of solar. When we talk about 484 watts per customer, that is less than 2 panels per customer, if you want to put it in that regard. So that's completely insufficient to power an individual home or anything like that. What the question kind of makes me think about reserve margin, and I don't really want to go to the end of our hour, but it's one of the things that's being discussed in the Georgia Power IRP now. So they've done a load forecast for what the load is going to be in the future, and then they put a resource portfolio against that has to meet it every hour of every day throughout that forecast, and have a reserve margin on top of what they're anticipating as the peak load, so that they don't run the risk of ever falling short and have, brownouts and blackouts like some utilities have been threatened with in Texas recently with the heat wave that went through. But they're not meeting that load exclusively with solar. They're solar is an increasing proportion of that portfolio that they're putting together to meet the load. I don't know if anybody, Maggie or anybody else wants to add to that.
Yeah, I'm pulling it up. We have we don't have how much solar is of the overall generating portfolio in this report. In our decarbonization report, we cover the percentage of generation from all the different sources, so that includes solar. So I will put that link in the chat, so and reference the page numbers where folks can find that information.
Okay, thanks, Maggie and Brian. So pivoting over to Duke, you mentioned that Duke has been scaling back its solar development in the short term, leading to lower levels than anticipated in 2017. Is there any reason to think Duke may change and scale back up? Would that be dependent on decisions made involving the NC Carbon Plan, North Carolina Carbon Plan?
Yeah, that's why I mentioned the carbon plan as on the what's next, because that will have a significant influence, and hopefully it's a favorable one on Duke's plan. And I don't want my comments about them scaling back over the years to be taken too out of context either. Like Duke Energy Progress is still the top of our leaderboard, even though they did not fulfill what we thought they would be in 2021 5 years ago, but they're still there. And what we've kind of seen is that in each of the iterations of their planning process, the short-term fulfillment has dropped a little bit, but their longer-term ambition has gone up quite a bit. So it's just a bit of a trade-off from short-term to long-term. And I do think the North Carolina Carbon Plan will have a significant role to play in for both Duke Energy Progress and Duke Energy Carolinas. And then Duke Energy Florida will be, they're influenced differently, so they won't be subject to that carbon plan, but they have a significant shared solar program called Clean Energy Connections, which SACE was supportive of when they petitioned the Public Service Commission for approval of that. And so that will dictate their scale up a lot, how quickly people subscribe to that, both their corporate customers, their individual residential customers, and even some of the municipalities' wholesale customers that they serve. So there's different drivers in different parts of the jurisdictions that they cover.
Thanks, Brian. And we're coming up to the end of the hour, so I think this question is a good one for us to end on and discuss. How do you see the use of this report in SACE and SACE supporter advocacy efforts moving forward?
Okay, so from the advocacy standpoint, I mean, we advocate in a lot of these regulatory proceedings, and I think there's a fair bit of competition amongst the utilities, even though they have their assigned territories, and so they don't compete for customers. They do compete for, let's say, prestige. And so arraying the utilities against one another, calling out the leaders and laggards, actually does help us in some of our regulatory filings. And then in terms of advocacy from our members, I mentioned, and I think you put in the chat, Kate, thank you for doing that, the action alert that we have for calling your elected officials and letting them know that we don't think that there is enough clean energy currently in the resource portfolios of the utilities, and we need some favorable policies to push that. So whether that's from the federal government, or whether it's done at the state legislatures, or at the regulatory agencies within the states, there's opportunities both for what we do, inside those halls, but then also what members can do by contacting elected officials.
Yeah, Brian, let me jump in here. This is Steve. I think that we are hopeful that by arming every one of you who has taken the time to look at this report to give you a sense of where your utility is in relationship to other utilities, to show you the level of ambition in comparison. And I think the reason that we have on several times referenced the Real Zero proposal is that SACE for a number of years has constantly pointed out to the utilities across the board that their ambition for investing in using the sun's power as the most elegant way, the cleanest way, and now the most cost-effective way to deliver electrons should be much more significant in their portfolio. The NextEra proposal is the first one that we've seen of any utility to actually begin to put that kind of goal out. The 90,000 megawatts to serve the load in the state of Florida is a bold proposal. And I think now that you are aware that a for-profit, very profitable company is projecting that solar power can do this kind of work in our region, you should absolutely discount repeatedly when other utilities are saying, oh, this isn't cost effective or whatever, this, that, and the other. I believe that what NextEra has put on the table completely changes that paradigm. And so it is our hope that you use our report plus this ongoing information that we continue to monitor, we'll continue to share, to raise the voice of all of us who advocate for clean energy, that there is so much more that we can be doing in our region in a cost-effective way to take advantage of solar power. And so I think this is what is tremendously important about you using this information and engaging as a consumer with your utility and as an advocate across the board with elected officials and others. So this is a powerful tool that we hope you will use, and we'll continue to work with everyone to help elevate their voice, because that's what's needed right now, particularly with the stagnation that we're seeing in Washington, D.C. We've got to be more and more vocal in our region.
Yeah, that's great, Stephen. There was a question that it was a specific question, but just generally too, maybe Brian, you can answer this, of how people can start the process of trying to get rooftop/distributed solar onto their homes. There's sometimes people face barriers, like maybe property owners don't think that there's an ability to, or there might not be, maybe it might not be fiscally viable in their state to do so. So can you just touch on, before we close out, maybe how folks who are interested in getting started with potentially adding solar to their homes or at their work, et cetera, how they could go about doing that?
Yeah, well, I think in general, there are developers out there in every state that specialize in different scales of solar. So some specialize in the residential market, others commercial and industrial, and then there's the folks that do the big utility scale as well. But it would depend on the state that you're in, and even within that, it would depend on which utility you're served by in terms of the economics of it. So my email address is up there on the screen, and rather than running through multiple things here trying to guesstimate where somebody might be writing in from, why don't you have that person send me an email, and we can go from there.
Great. And I think this is a good spot for us to close out on. We did have a lot of questions come in, again, a boatload of questions. So we have tracked all of those, and we will follow up with people after the webinar. And a reminder that we will send a recording of this presentation and the report itself shortly, sometime this week. And if you do have any questions, please reach out to us. And we thank you all for being here. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.